Hey everyone, in this tutorial, we're going to create a realistic textured notepad using Affinity Publisher. Now, I'm using the desktop version of the app, but the overall process is the same for the iPad. The tools are just laid out differently. This tutorial will be a bit on the long side because we have a lot to cover, but I've broken it down into sections so you can easily step away or jump around when you need to. So let's get started. When using Publisher, you can create a single or double page canvas. A double page canvas would be perfect for something like a workbook or a magazine. Since this is going to be a single notepad in portrait orientation, I'm going to create a single page canvas, and I know that I want to use this in Goodnotes, so I'm going to set my canvas size at 8.5 by 11 inches. So I'll go up to File and New. And I want to make sure my dimensions are 8.5 by 11 and it's set in portrait orientation. You can also just click on the preset here. I'm going to keep my DPI at 300. I don't plan to print this, it's going to be used digitally, but I'm going to keep that there and I can always change that upon export. And finally, I want to make sure that default master is checked off so that it automatically creates a master page, which we'll talk about in a little bit. If I go over to pages, I want to make sure that facing pages is turned off. When it's on, it's going to create that double page canvas that I talked about. And again, that's not what we're looking for. So I'll turn that off and make sure that my number of pages is set to 3. We're going to create 3 different types of pages so you have flexibility with your notebook. Everything else can stay the same, so I'll hit create. Before we create our notepad, let's take a quick look at master pages and how they work. So master pages allow you to create a consistent background or multiple backgrounds if you need different layouts that can be used throughout the pages in your document. So this is a planner that I created a couple of years ago, and this has 2 master pages attached to it. One is the closed version of the planner and the other is the open version. Now, this was a fully dated planner, so it has a ton of pages in it in addition to any of the extras that I created. So being able to create just 2 backgrounds and tie the corresponding pages to them saved a great deal of time. Additionally, this planner has hyperlinks either to various parts of the book or to outside sites. The hyperlinks can be added to the master pages a single time rather than having to add them to each individual page, again, saving time. Now, when you create your document, again, you want to make sure that you turn on default master when you're setting it up, and it's automatically going to give you your first master page. Once you're in the canvas, you can add additional master pages so that you can set up different layouts for different scenarios. So you'll find master pages under the pages panel, and if this isn't open on yours, just go to window and you can turn it on. For those of you who are in the iPad version, you'll find it under the second icon, which if you can't find it, just use the question mark and you'll see labels. It's under pages. So if you tap that, you can cycle between masters and subpages simply by using the arrows. You can also tap and use the flywheel. Now to get between the two here in the iPad version, you're just going to tap between them and you can do the same with the individual pages. For those on the desktop version, to get between the masters and the subpages, you'll just double click and you'll see a gray outline form around whatever page you're currently in. It's really important to pay attention to that because if I were to start adding background elements here on page 1, it's not going to apply to the others. I want to make sure that any consistent background elements I'm creating, I'm doing in the master pages. So I'll double click and you'll see that gray outline. And if I go ahead and add a second one now, let's take a quick look at how they actually work. So if I'm in master page A and I grab a square and just drag it out, you're going to see that it automatically applies it to the 3 pages that we set up because these are currently tied to master A. If I go here to page 2 and double click it and then right click it and change the master to B, that box is going to disappear because I don't currently have anything in there. So if I double click into Master B and go back to the swatches and grab a different color, if I drag out that yellow box, it's automatically going to apply there. Now, in the case of what we're creating in this tutorial, we only need 1 master background. It's going to be the blank version of the notepad. We're going to create 2 overlays for that master. One is aligned and one is graph, and they just sit as a layer on top of the master. So for this one, I'm going to get rid of B here. I'm just going to right click and delete, and it's going to give me a message that anything that's tied to that is going to lose whatever information is inside of it, and that's fine. So I'll delete that master. And now I need to make sure that I tie this back to A because we're going to start building our notepad, and I want to make sure that it gets everything the other two pages do. So I'll double click into master A, and I'm going to remove this. And now we can begin building up our background. I'm going to start by creating a desktop, and I'm going to use a wood image from the stock studio. Again, if you don't have yours open, just go up to window and you can turn it on. So I just typed in wood, and I'm going to pull this one in. And when I add it to my master page, you can see that it's automatically added it there. Now I'm going to size this up, and I want to place it exactly where I want it. And you can see the bounds of the canvas there. Because what I want to do is rasterize and trim this so that anything hanging outside of the canvas is confined within the canvas. So I'll go to my layer, right click, and rasterize and trim. Whenever you're using texture, make sure that you do that because anything that's outside of the canvas is just extra information and it's not necessary. All it does is add to the size of your canvas. So to keep things manageable, make sure you're rasterizing and trimming wherever you need to. So that's the desktop background. Now I want to start building the notepad. So we're going to start by laying down the shapes that make up the notepad, and then we'll begin adding some dimension using effects from the FX panel and finish it up with some actual texture. Just about everything we do is going to be non-destructive, so you can easily adjust as you go along. You can make different versions, whatever you'd like. So let's go ahead and start with the shapes for the notepad, and it's basically going to be a series of rectangles. Now I have created a palette for this tutorial that I've provided in the description below. If you want to use the same colors that I do, it's totally up to you. I want to start by creating the base of the notepad. Not a lot of this is going to be showing, but my main purpose for creating it is I want something to tie a very deep drop shadow to. And I don't want to tie it to the pages themselves because in reality, paper wouldn't have a really deep drop shadow. So I'm going to grab this sort of beige color and no stroke, and I'll just drag out a rectangle across the entire canvas. Now the reason I'm doing this is because I want to make sure that I have sort of an 8.5 by 11 aspect ratio. I need to size this down a little bit. So I'm going to hold shift down and just size down. And you can make yours whatever size you'd like. What I want to do is give most of the real estate in my canvas to the notepad because ultimately that's what I'm going to be writing on. If you want to have more desktop, it's entirely your choice. So that's my background. I'm just going to go ahead and change this to base. The next thing I want to do is create my paper. Now, in this case, we're looking top down on a notepad. It's not a book that's open where you'd have pages sort of fanning out on either side. So we only need to create one page and just give it a really deep shadow. So with that base layer selected, I'm going to Command J and duplicate it and then change it to this off-white color. So I want to make sure that's the fill and not the stroke. I'm going to keep it out at either side here, but I'm going to move this up slightly so that the base is sort of peeking out. And then finally, I want to add the binding at the top. So I'm just going to Command J and duplicate that base layer, and I'm just going to size it to where I need it. Whenever you're creating something like this, you don't have to start from scratch each time. If you're using the same shape, just duplicate and size down. So I want to change the names of these to binding and pages. All right, so that's the basics of the notepad. One final touch that I want to add is some torn paper effect like you see here. So I'm going to use the pen tool for that. Now the other option is to use Studio Link to go into Designer, and you can use the pencil tool. I'm actually fine with using the pen tool, so I'm going to grab that. I'll zoom in here so you can see what I'm doing. And I'm temporarily going to change this to a blue fill so that you can see it. So I'm going to start from outside, and I'm going to be as random as possible about this because if this was actually torn paper, it's not going to be thought out and planned. So let's just start clicking around. I can always adjust these with the node tool once I'm done. So let me grab the node tool. Actually, let me grab the move tool first and just take a peek at this. I'm going to pull this down and clip it inside the pages so that anything on the outside is not shown. And I think I'm going to make some changes. So I want to sort of drag some stuff around, maybe grab this guy and drag it up and drag it over. So I'm just going to speed this up as I fix it. All right, I think that's good enough. I'm going to call that done. Now I don't need to do the same thing for the second one that I want to add. I'm just going to Command J to duplicate that and then go to the top and choose flip horizontal. Now I want to move these up significantly because I don't want to take up too much real estate with some torn paper. So I'll just tap my arrow keys to move these up. Now I'm going to go ahead and change this to off-white, and it's going to disappear until we add our drop shadow. All right, so at this point I have all of my shapes in place and I want to start adding some texture and dimension. So I'm going to start with the binding. And again, I'm going to use textures from the stock studio. So I'm going to type in craft paper, and there's actually a nice piece of craft paper right there in pixels, but it's really large. So I'm going to grab my transform panel. I'm going to click in the middle here, and I want to size this down significantly. All right, I'm going to rotate this, place that there, and I think I'm just going to size it down so that it's inside the canvas. This is going to be the texture for the binding. And I'll clip that inside. Now I'm going to use the same texture for the base. So I don't need it to cover the entire base. I can just Command J and clip this inside here and just move it down. To have texture cover the entire base when you can't actually see it really doesn't make sense. So I'm just going to use that same small one and not worry about it. Now, one final texture I want to add is to the pages. And I'm actually going to use the craft texture again, but we're going to use blend options to make some changes to it. So I'll Command J, and I'm just going to clip one in place here. And this time I will drag it all the way down to the bottom. And I need to flip these. Let's just move this down. So we don't have any drop shadows in place, which is part of the reason you're not seeing anything. But let me go ahead and select this craft paper. And the first thing I want to do is head up to blend options here. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail about how blend options work in this tutorial, but I do have an entire tutorial about using these with texture in Designer, and it works the same way here in Publisher. For this tutorial, I'm just going to jump right to this first graph and to this node, and I'm going to drag it all the way down and then drag it to the left. What I'm aiming for is to have just the texture show up and then have the color that I originally placed in there come through. So I'm just going to drag that out. And I think that looks good. I need to stretch this out a little bit. It looks like the texture is kind of squished. All right, so let me just drag this out. And again, because I have it going on the outside of the canvas, I'm going to right click, rasterize, and trim. And now because this is sitting on top of these two layers, it's also going to apply to the torn paper, which is really important because even if you can't necessarily see it, you want to make sure that you're applying the texture to it so it doesn't look like a flat vector sitting on top of your paper. So at this point, I want to start adding my drop shadows. So again, let's start with the binding. Now, whenever you're adding drop shadows to add dimension, you want to think about what you're adding them to. In this case, this would be a very thin piece of craft board and probably be about 2 to 3 millimeters. So there would be a deeper shadow than on the regular paper, but it still wouldn't be really, really deep. So we're going to add an outer shadow, and I'm going to keep the offset down for right now and just bring the radius up. And I think I'll bring the intensity up a little bit. When you're creating something like this, you can go a little bit past where you normally would because it's going to be on a digital display, but you don't want to go so far that it looks fake. So let me click close, and I'm going to back up. And I just want to make sure that it doesn't look like it's floating on top. So since we're going to have some torn paper under there, I think this is fine for right now. I can always adjust it if I need to. Now I don't need to start over again with the other layers. What I'm going to do is Command C after I select that binding layer, and I can either go up to Edit and choose Paste FX, or I can choose Command Control V once I select a layer. So let's start with one of the two torn pieces. I'm going to choose Control Command V, and it's automatically going to apply that same exact drop shadow to the torn paper. Now you can see this is way too deep because in this case, paper is a lot thinner than the craft cardboard would be. So I'm going to go back into my FX Studio and just adjust this. I'll pull the radius down, and I'll pull the offset down, and I want to pull the intensity way down. I think I'll just play around with the radius a little bit. All right, I'll click close. And now I'm going to Command C to select, or I'm sorry, to copy that. I'll select the other layer and then again, Command Control V, and it's going to apply that to the other piece. And I think that looks good. We might want to pull that down just a bit. All right, we're going to do something additional to this to give it a little bit less of a perfect feel once we get past adding all these drop shadows. So just sit tight on that. So one final one I want to do is, of course, the page itself. So I'm just going to apply the last one I selected. And I'll go ahead and do Control Command V. And then I just need to adjust it. So let's move in to the bottom here. Now in this case, we're talking about a full stack of paper. It's not actually a single piece of paper. So we want to take that into account when we're creating our drop shadow. So I'm going to click in and I want to bring this out. And I'm going to bring the offset out. And I might even bring the intensity out a little bit. And I'm actually going to bring this down this way. And I can always play around with this if I don't like how it looks, but this is a good start. And then let's just add one to our base. Now this is the one that's going to be the deepest because this is the entire notepad. So this is the backing, all of the paper, plus the craft binding. So let's go ahead and open up the FX Studio. And I'm going to bring this way out for the radius, way out for the offset. And I'm going to bring the intensity up just a touch. I like how that's looking. I feel a bit like this is floating. So let's go back in and maybe adjust the angle a little bit. So I like that. I'm not worried about the spillover here. That's coming from the binding because, again, in reality, if I were looking at something top down, there would be some spillover just because of the notepad itself. So I'm going to keep that as is. Now, a couple of things that I want to do to the notepad just to finish it off. I want to put a little text up here. So I'm just going to grab my artistic text and type my notes. I want to change the font to something that's a little thicker. I'm going to use the font Impact and grab my move tool and move it to where I want. Now, the problem with this is it just looks like some text sitting on top and it looks rather fake. So what I want to do is use blend options again, but this time, instead of removing any of the color from this layer, I actually want to pull the texture through from the bottom one. So with this selected, I'll go up to blend options again, and this time I want to focus on this side. Specifically, I want to pull this node down so the lighter areas of the texture start coming through. And then I want to pull this side to the right. This is going to start pulling some of the darker parts, like these little flecks. And then I think I'm going to turn off linear and just see if adding a mid-tone is going to make that better. I like how that's looking. I want this to have a feel as if it's stamped on there. So I like how the texture looks. The problem is it still doesn't look like it's stamped on because the edges of my text are too perfect. So what I want to do is use Studio Link to bounce over to Photo and add a displacement filter. Now, the problem with that is in order to use that filter, I need to have a rasterized layer because it's a raster effect. So I want to make sure that I copy this layer, and I'm just going to drag this beneath and turn it off. This is just a backup in case I need to make some changes because this is live and editable text, but this is going to get rasterized. so that I can use it in photo. Now that this is rasterized and in place, I'm going to head over to photo by clicking here. And I'm going to use one of the regular filters. You could also do this displacement as a live filter. I'm just going to choose distort under filters and displace. And I'm given two options. The first is that I can load a map from a file, or I can load a map from the layers beneath. And in this case, I'm going to load from a file because I already know from making this other one that this craft texture doesn't accomplish what I want. What I want to do is have the edges broken up as if it's ink. So instead, I'm going to pull an actual ink texture. So I'll click load map from file, and I'm going to use a Texture Labs texture that I've pulled, and I've linked to the Texture Labs site below. And I want to find one that's going to break this up nicely. I actually think this Texture Labs 251 is perfect. So I'll click OK, and you can see that it's automatically kind of made some jaggy marks here on the text, and it's a little too harsh. So what I'm going to do is play with the strength here. I really just want to have the edges slightly broken up, again, so that it doesn't look so perfect. So I'm just going to play around till I find the right spot. And it's just enough that it's not perfect. If I zoom in really close, you can see that it's broken up. Now I want to also do this with the paper here, except in this case, I'm going to use a paper texture. So I'll grab these two curves, and we can stay right in photo for this. I'm going to Command J to copy them and then group them. And again, just move them down to the bottom here because I want to click and rasterize both of these. And you want to make sure that you're preserving your layer effects so the drop shadows stay in place. And now I can add a paper texture to this. So I just need to add it to one, and then I can apply it to the other. Let me zoom in again. So I will go to Filters, Distort, Displace, and I'm going to grab a paper texture. And you can see that it's already broken up the edges. Now again, that's a little too intense. So I'm just going to move this around until it's right where I want it. And I think -5 pixels or -6 will work nicely. So I'm going to click apply. It's really subtle, but it can be noticed. So it's just a good idea to break up really harsh edges whenever you're trying for realism, because again, if somebody were to tear this paper, it's not going to be perfect like this. So now I'm going to select this other layer, and all I need to do is filters and repeat displacement map, and it's automatically going to apply that. So we have those done. Let's head back to Publisher, and we're going to create our pencil. So for this pencil, we're going to follow the same process that we did with the Notepad. We're going to create our shapes, add our texture and our dimension. So I'm actually going to do this as a time lapse for the most part, but I'm going to break in the time lapse where something differs, because there's a couple of occasions where I'm going to jump into Designer and use some of the tools there that aren't in Publisher. So I'm going to get started, and I will see you on the other side. Okay, so this is one of the points where I'm going to break and go over to Designer, because it has both the Shape Builder tool and the Knife tool, which don't exist here in Publisher. So I'm going to pop over here, and I want to grab first this rectangle. What I want to do is select the rectangle and the triangle, because I need to cut away the portions of the triangle that are sitting outside of this. So I just want to make sure that it's lined up where I want it, so it's as close as possible. I'm also going to cut off these little spots from the pencil itself. So I'll select both shapes, go to my shape builder, and I'm going to click on minus. And when I hover over any of those overlaps, it's going to show me exactly where I can click to remove stuff. All right, so I think that looks good. The next thing I want to do is break up this bottom part a little bit, because it's a little too perfect. So I'm going to use the Knife tool to do this. And I'll just start drawing sort of a jagged line. Again, I'm trying not to be too careful, just like with the torn paper. And I'll go over to my layers, and just remove any of that excess. And now that's a little bit broken up. It's not perfect, but it doesn't need to be. It's going to be at a very small size. Really, I just wanted to make sure that it wasn't straight. The last thing I want to do here is this rectangle that I used to create the graphite. It's also too perfect. So I'm going to go into my color here, and I'm going to add a stroke in the same color. And I want to use one of my brushes, specifically one of the dry media brushes that are built in, to change that stroke to something more gritty and textural. So I'll just click here until I find one that I like. All right, I think that one looks good. I can always change the stroke size just to bring it in a little bit. But again, it just kind of makes it so that it doesn't look so perfect. And then finally, I want to take the corner tool to this curve, this triangle, and just round the tip out a little bit. And that should be it for Designer. I'm going to head back into Publisher and finish this up. Okay, so for the most part, I have everything in place. I want to add my textures and the rest of my dimension, but I want to move it into place at the bottom first, and I'm going to do the rest of this in real time. So I'm going to group my pencil together and size this down a lot. And I'm just going to make it a little taller. I'll tilt it, and I want this down at the bottom here, slightly tilted. I don't want to tilt my notepad because I need to write on that. But when you're doing stuff with realism, little touches like just a slight tilt go a long way. So I'm doing this because I want to make sure that my shadows fall the right way. There are a couple of touches I want to add before I start adding the texture itself. So I'm going to select this inner rectangle, and this was just a duplicate of this main curve that I then moved into the middle here. I'm going to add an outer glow to this to give it a bit of a highlight. So I'm just going to bring the radius up just a touch. I don't want it to be too intense. I just want it to be subtle, so it's seen but not overwhelming. So probably right about there. The next thing that I want to do is I'm going to make a copy of this curve and just remove this second rectangle. I want to use this to create a shadow and highlight on this. So I'm going to clip this inside and then just push this to the left here and make this a lot lighter. So double click and then just drag this up. And I want my highlight to be tilted slightly because the pencil's tilted. And I'll just move this up. Let's just tilt this out a little bit. All right, I'm going to grab a Gaussian blur and blur that up. And I'm going to change this to screen and drop the opacity. I'm going to use a copy of this and move it to the bottom. And in this case, I want the majority of it here on the right. This is actually going to be the shadow. So I'm going to double click and move this down. And I need to change the blend mode. So I'm going to change that to multiply. It's already blurred just enough. All right, I'm going to adjust some of my highlights here. So I used a fill to create the eraser. So I'm just going to, since the pencil is slightly tilted, I want the highlight to be tilted. And I'm going to do the same thing for the fill on the metal. I'm not really sure what they call this, the little brace thing. So I just want to tilt it slightly. All right, kind of following for the eraser. And then I want to add a drop shadow to the entire pencil. So I'll go ahead and click Effects and Outer Shadow. And this is going to be a lot deeper than the rest of them because this again is the entire pencil. So I'll bring the radius up, the offset up, and I I'll bring that in just a touch and maybe change the angle a little bit. All right. So that part's done. Let's go ahead and add our textures. So I want to use a wood texture for the main part of the pencil as well as the pencil itself. So I'll go back to my stock studio and I'm going to type in wood. And I think I'm going to use the same texture for the body of the pencil that I used for the background for the desktop. Now I can size this down a lot because I want this to be for the pencil. So the texture is a little too large for that. I'll go ahead and turn it so that the grain follows the pencil. Now you could also add the texture first while it's up and down. Might be a little bit easier. And then I will clip this into place inside that. And I'm going to change the blend mode to, I think, overlay, maybe soft light. I'll go with soft light. All right, so that's the first one. Now for this one, I want to use a sort of splintery one. So I'm going to go to Pixabay because I know there's one in there that I like. I'm going to use this guy right here. And again, I'm going to size it down significantly. So this shouldn't have anything hanging over. I need to rasterize the other one that I just pulled in. And again, I want to make sure that the grain follows the direction of the pencil. So I'm just going to tilt it. I'll clip it inside the curve. And I want to make sure it's beneath the point. And I'll change the blend mode of it to, I think, overlay. And I am going to rasterize and trim this just to get any of the excess. I'll also go back to this one and rasterize and trim. There's two more textures I want to add, one to the metal and one to the eraser. So I've typed in metal and I'm going to pull this guy in, size it down significantly. I'll rotate it. Again, I'm just trying to get the grain to sort of follow the metal itself. I don't want to use this stained part. I'm going to use this part right here. So I'll clip that into place and I'm going to change the blend mode, I think, to overlay and just bring the opacity down a touch. I just want to break up some of that perfectness. So I'm going to move this around and just see. Actually, that stained part might work nicely. So I don't need to rasterize and trim this because there's nothing outside the canvas. I think that looks good. I'm going to leave that as is. And then for the eraser, I'm going to use a concrete texture, which might sound weird, but concrete has sort of pock marks on it that really lend itself to erasers. So let's find this guy here. Bring that down. And I want some of those little dots there or here. So I'm just going to size it down significantly. And I want to make sure that that line isn't showing there. So I'll just clip that into place. And I think that looks good. And change the blend mode to soft light. Now that we have our notepad and our pencil in place and all of our textures, we're ready to add the 2 additional pages here. So again, this master page is tied to all of these. This first one is going to be the blank version of the notepad, so we don't need to do anything here. I'm going to double click into this one and create a lined page. So this is going to sit as a layer on top of the master background there, and I'm going to use my pen tool to do this. So I'll click on the pen tool and I want to go to my swatches and choose this blue color as a stroke and no fill. And the first thing I want to do is create a margin, and I'm going to sit outside of the canvas, click, hold shift down and click again. And as long as snapping is on, it's going to create a perfect line. And I'll just bring that up and I'm going to option drag down. I'm going to make mine sort of college ruled. You can make yours as thick as you want. Once I create that first one, I'm going to keep that selected and just do Command J all the way down. Super simple. Now it's hanging off the edge, but I'm going to show you how to correct for that in a little bit. And I think that's good. I'm going to group these together just to keep everything organized. All right, so I'm going to click out of that, and now I want to create the red line that goes from the top down. So again, I'll grab my pen tool, and this time I'm going to choose this red color as my stroke. And I'll start underneath the binding because I do actually want it to show on the torn pieces because again, these came from the same notebook. So you might see little fragments of the lines. I'll go ahead and click. I'm going to size this down a little bit. I'll click, hold shift, and click at the bottom. So now that we have our lines in place, there are some overhang, and we could of course just take this and push it in where we want. But instead what I'm going to do is grab the rectangle tool, and I'm going to drag out a rectangle that's the size of the paper just beneath the binding. And I'll take this group. This has no stroke and no fill. I don't want it to have anything inside of it. It's an invisible rectangle. And I'm going to clip this group inside that rectangle. And that's going to clip away any of the overhang. And I'll just zoom in here and make sure that it goes to the edge. I can always tap to move it. I think that looks good. I think what I'll do though is just maybe play around with the blend mode of that group. And just see, I think multiply is going to work best, and I'm going to bring the opacity down. I want this to look sort of like a vintage page. All right, so that's the lined paper. So now we have the blank paper, the lined paper, and let's make our graph paper. Now, again, if you wanted to, you could use your pen tool if you needed to be very specific with the size of the graph. But I'm going to show you a really quick way to do this. I'm going to grab the table tool and just drag out a table that's the size of the page. And I want to use this side here until I get a nice square. And then I'm going to drag this arrow over. Now, right now, this is a graph. It's not a stroke, but I'm going to get it in place first. And then I want to go up to layer and convert to curves. So now I have strokes here. And again, I've got something hanging over the edge. So I'm just going to drag this out slightly. I'll make another invisible rectangle. And I'll adjust the color of the graph once I'm done. Again, no stroke and no fill, and I'll clip this inside. And let's just change the color of our curves here. So right now it's a black stroke. I'm going to use that same blue that I did for the other. And again, I'll change it to multiply and just bring the opacity down. So let's just click out. That might be a little too low. All right. And if I go up to the top here, you can see that it is hitting some of these pages, and that's what I want because again, I want it to look as if those are being torn from the same pad. And I'll just adjust this a little bit. It looks like the other rectangle's not quite in the right spot, so I'll just move it. So now we have a blank paper, a lined paper, and our graph paper. And we're ready to export this. So let's talk a little bit about export best practices if you know you're going to create this for something like Goodnotes. So we have a lot of texture in here, which is really heavy and can weigh the file down. It can also weigh Goodnotes down. So what I want to do is save my main file as, let's see, Notepad original pencil so that I have that there. What I'm going to do is go through here and I want to rasterize this. So I'll close this out and then open it back up again. And I want to first go into my master page here and I'm going to group everything together. Right click and rasterize, and it's going to show as a pixel. The reason I save this off somewhere else is if I need to go back in and make changes, I have that available to me. I'll go ahead and click here. And you can see that it's already rasterized there. I don't need to do anything to this top one, but I do want to rasterize this layer as well as the graph. And that's just making this file as small as I possibly can so that it runs better in Goodnotes. So now I'm ready to export this as a PDF. So if you want to use this in Goodnotes or another annotation app, you need to export as a PDF. In this case, I'm going to use digital high quality. I'm actually going to bring the DPI, let's check at 192. It's going to be used for digital, but that knocked it from 4.92 megabytes to 1.97. And because I'm going to be using this on my iPad, it's not going to be printed. I really don't need to keep it at 300. So I'll go ahead and click export, save it off. And now we're ready to pull it in to Goodnotes. So let's do that next. All right, so I'm back in my iPad here and I'm in Goodnotes. And the first thing I want to do is hit plus and import. I'll find that file that I saved and it's going to pull it in. And if I flip through, you'll see the lined page and the graph page. Now, if you want to add additional copies of any of these, just go up to the three dots here. Go up to the plus sign here and you can go ahead and add the current template. So whatever one you're in, if you hit plus, do current template, and you can add as many as you want. And this is running quite nicely again because we compressed it instead of having all of that texture sitting and weighing that down. So that's it. That is how to create a realistic notepad and pencil in Affinity Publisher. If you enjoyed this tutorial and like my teaching style, check out my full-length Skillshare classes. I've linked them below. I am going to be creating a full class on Affinity Publisher for iPad, so definitely check out my Skillshare channel. I also have my own school site where I post my classes as well. I've linked that below as well. If you did enjoy this tutorial, you might want to check out one of these two next. Thanks for watching.